The measuring rope lay coiled in the red dirt, still as a sleeping serpent. 40 feet of hemp, each half-foot marked with a notch of charcoal. Amos Reed walked the edge of his property for the third night in a row, dragging the rope behind him through the dust, stopping to hammer iron stakes into the clay at intervals only he could decode. From their porches, neighbors watched. Oil lamps glowed in windows, illuminating faces full of quiet curiosity. They assumed he was planning a fence. They were mistaken. The stakes marked where death would bloom. The rope measured how far that death would reach. And the quiet blacksmith, who had returned from war desiring only stillness, had spent 4 years engineering destruction for men who once wore gray and now wore white hoods. In 2 weeks, 200 Klansmen would ride onto his land, expecting to find a terrified black man pleading for his life. Instead, they would find midnight set ablaze, earth turned inside out, and a lesson in what happens when patient men run out of patience. The war had been finished for 3 years when Amos Reed returned to Talbot County, Georgia, in the spring of 1868. He arrived on a Thursday afternoon, stepping off the train in Talbottom with a canvas sack holding all he owned: 2 shirts, 1 pair of trousers, a razor, a Bible whose margins were filled with numbers no one could make sense of, and his discharge papers from the 14th United States Colored Infantry. He was 31. He walked with a hitch in his left leg, souvenir of a mine collapse near Petersburg. He spoke seldom and never smiled. The blacksmith shop he bought sat 2 miles outside of town on 40 acres of scrubland no one else wanted. The previous owner, a white man named Horace Garvin, had died without heirs. The property sold at auction for $70, and Amos paid in Union scrip that the auctioneer accepted with poorly hidden disgust. The land was mostly red clay and pine, useless for cotton, barely enough for subsistence. A creek marked the eastern edge. The shop itself was a low stone building with a dirt floor, and a forge that hadn't seen fire in 2 years. Amos moved in that same day. He cleaned the forge, repaired the bellows leather, and by Saturday was hammering out horseshoes. Within a month, work was steady. Farmers brought plowshares to be fixed. Merchants needed hinges and latches, and even white customers came, because Amos charged fair and his work held. He was polite without being subservient. He said, "Sir," to white men because it was easier than not saying it. But he met their eyes when he did, and some of them took note. He lived alone in a cabin he built behind the shop. 14 feet square, a stone chimney, 1 window facing west. He grew vegetables in a small patch. He bought flour, salt, coffee from the general store in town. Sundays he walked to the Colored Baptist Church on the east side of Talbotton, sat in the back pew, and left before anyone could speak with him. The pastor, Reverend Silas Oakes, tried twice to invite him for dinner. Both times Amos thanked him and offered no explanation. The silence was deliberate. The war had shown Amos things about himself he had no wish to recall and no intention of discussing. He had enlisted in October 1863 at a recruiting station in Nashville, 3 months after the 14th Colored Infantry was formed. Before the war, he had been a blacksmith's apprentice in Chattanooga, learning from a free black man named Thomas Bright, who knew talent when he saw it. When Thomas died in 1861, Amos took over the shop and kept working. He might have stayed through the whole war, exempt as a skilled tradesman. But in August 1863, Confederate raiders burned his shop and killed 2 customers who were inside when the torches came. Amos enlisted the next week. He discovered he had a gift for explosives. The Union Army needed men who understood metal and chemistry, men who could work with powder and fuses without blowing themselves up. Amos understood. He became a sapper, one of the engineers who tunneled under Confederate lines and packed the spaces with gunpowder. He learned to calculate blast radius by powder type and soil. He learned to set fuses that burned exactly as long as needed, no more. He learned to kill men by the dozen without ever seeing their faces. At Petersburg, his unit collapsed a section of Confederate trench, creating a crater 30 feet deep and 200 feet across. 19 Confederate soldiers died in that blast. Amos counted them afterward, walking the crater's edge at dawn, noting the scattered pieces that had once been whole. He felt nothing. The absence of feeling disturbed him, more than any nightmare could have. He decided when the war ended that he would never set another charge. But memory is architecture. Once you know how something breaks, you can never unknow it. James Whitfield owned the land next to Amos Reed's 40 acres. 320 acres of decent bottomland that grew respectable cotton, worked by 8 black families living in cabins along the river road, receiving shares each year that never quite covered what they owed at Whitfield's commissary. Whitfield was 47, twice widowed, father to 3 sons who had died at Chancellorsville, Gettysburg, and Bentonville, respectively. The war had taken his children but left him his land, and he had spent the 3 years since Appomattox rebuilding as best he could, hampered by labor shortages and falling cotton prices. He needed more land. Specifically, he needed Amos Reed's 40 acres. The creek that ran along Amos's eastern boundary continued south through Whitfield's property, watering his best cotton fields. Control of the headwaters would let Whitfield divert water during dry summers, extending his growing season. More importantly, Amos's land sat on the main road to Talbotton, and Whitfield imagined a cotton gin sitting there, saving him the cost of hauling bales 3 miles to the public gin in town. He made his first offer in July 1868, 3 months after Amos arrived. $100 for the whole parcel. Take it or leave it. Amos declined. Whitfield raised his offer to $150. Amos declined again. In September, Whitfield offered $200, more than the land was worth by any honest measure. Amos thanked him for his generosity and said he wasn't interested in selling. Whitfield's tone shifted. You need to think carefully, boy. Things are different now than they were during the war. Folks around here don't take kindly to coloreds who forget their place. Amos looked at him a long moment. I know my place. I bought it at auction. Got the deed registered at the courthouse. Papers can be lost. Whitfield said. Fires happen. Amos returned to his forge without answering. In October, 2 men came to the shop at night. Amos heard them before he saw them, boots scuffing in the dirt outside. He set down the plate he was cleaning and moved to the cabin doorway. Moonlight showed 2 figures in the yard, both wearing flour sacks over their heads with eye holes cut out. One carried a torch. The other held a shotgun across his chest. You've been told to leave, the man with the torch said. His voice was muffled by the sack but recognizable. Elijah Cantrell, Whitfield's overseer. Mr. Whitfield made you a fair offer. More than fair. Time you accept it. Amos said nothing. You deaf? Boy. I hear you fine. Then you understand. Either you sell that land or things are going to get unpleasant. Amos let the silence stretch. Finally he said, I'm staying. The man with the torch laughed, not pleasantly. We'll see about that. They left. Amos stood in the doorway until their footsteps faded, then went inside and loaded his rifle. He sat in the dark cabin until dawn, listening to every cricket and distant dog. Nothing happened. But the message was clear. The next morning, he found a noose hanging from the oak tree beside his shop, swaying gently in the October breeze. Amos cut it down and burned it in his forge. Then he opened the Bible with the numbered margins and began to calculate. The numbers were formulas he had developed during the war, relationships between powder weight, soil density, and effective blast radius. He had recorded them in code, using biblical verse numbers as coordinates and margin notes as coefficients. To anyone else, the notations looked like theology. To Amos, they were a library of destruction. He needed the exact dimensions of his land. The 40 acres formed a rough rectangle, approximately 900 feet east to west and 900 feet north to south. The shop and cabin sat near the center, about 400 feet from the main road. The creek was the eastern boundary. Pine forest covered the north and west. The southern border ran along Whitfield's cotton fields. That afternoon, Amos bought 40 feet of hemp rope from the general store, along with a can of charcoal marking ink. That evening he spent in his cabin, measuring the rope into 6-inch intervals and marking each with a black notch. When he finished, he had a measuring tool divided into 80 segments. At dusk on October 24, 1868, Amos began walking his property with the rope. He started at the northwest corner and worked south, dragging the rope behind him, stopping every 40 feet to drive an iron stake into the ground. The stakes were scrap metal he had been saving, each about 18 inches long and sharpened to a point. To anyone watching, and several neighbors were watching from their porches, it looked like he was preparing to build a fence. He was not building a fence. The stakes marked blast points. Each one represented a place where Amos planned to bury powder. The spacing was calculated to create overlapping kill zones, areas where multiple explosions would combine, maximizing casualties while wasting minimal energy. He was designing a killing field. He worked 3 nights in a row, always at dusk when there was just enough light to see, but not enough for observers to note details. By the 3rd night, he had placed 63 stakes in a pattern that surrounded his property on 3 sides, leaving the eastern creek boundary unguarded. If anyone approached from the main road, they would enter the kill zone. If they came from the north or west through the pines, they would enter the kill zone. If they came from the south across Whitfield's fields, they would enter the kill zone. The only safe approach was from the east across the creek, and Amos knew mounted men would not cross water if they could avoid it. On the 4th night, he began digging. Each charge needed a hole 18 inches deep and 12 inches wide. 63 charges. At 2 holes per night, working only in darkness to avoid notice, he calculated 32 nights to finish. He gave himself 35 for weather and interruption. November moved into December. Amos worked his forge by day, filling orders for horseshoes and hinges and pot hooks, keeping up the appearance of a simple tradesman going about simple business. At night he became something else. He dug methodically, spacing the work so no single area showed concentrated disturbance. He spread the excavated dirt thinly across his garden plot, where it would be explained by spring planting. The digging was the easy part. Getting the powder was harder. Black powder wasn't difficult to find in Georgia in 1868, but buying large amounts would raise questions Amos couldn't afford. He needed at least 60 pounds, maybe more depending on soil. A farmer buying 10 for clearing stumps raised no suspicion. A black man buying 60 brought visits from men in hoods. Amos solved it through patience and arithmetic. He traveled to Augusta, 30 miles northeast, and bought 5 pounds from a hardware merchant who didn't know him. 2 weeks later, he went to Columbus, 60 miles west, and bought another 5. He made 6 trips over 2 months, visiting towns as far as Macon and LaGrange, never buying more than 5 from any one merchant, always paying cash, always giving a different name when asked. By mid-December, he had 72 pounds of powder stored in sealed tins beneath his cabin floorboards. He also needed fuses. Commercial fuses burned at predictable rates, but Amos wanted more control. He made his own, using cotton strings soaked in saltpeter solution and dried in precise lengths. He tested each batch by burning samples and timing them with his pocket watch. He calibrated until he had fuses that burned exactly 1 inch per 3 seconds, reliable within a margin he found acceptable. On December 18th, the first snow fell. Unusual for Georgia, but not unheard of. Amos watched the flakes drift past his window and calculated how snow cover would affect blast patterns. Wet soil absorbed more energy than dry, meaning he would need to increase powder loads by about 15% to maintain effective radius. He adjusted his numbers. Christmas passed. Amos spent it alone, eating cornbread and beans, reading his Bible without seeing the words. The margins whispered formulas that had nothing to do with salvation. On December 27th, Elijah Cantrell returned with the same flour sack hood and the same shotgun. This time, 4 other men came with him, all masked. They burned Amos's barn, a small structure that held nothing but hay and old tools. Amos watched from his cabin window as flames consumed it. When the men rode away laughing, he walked out and studied the fire until it collapsed to coals. The next morning, he found a note pinned to his door, crude handwriting on torn paper. Last chance. Sell or burn. Amos folded the note carefully and placed it in his Bible. Then he resumed digging. By January 15, 1869, all 63 holes were complete. That night, Amos began loading them with powder. He worked with surgical precision, measuring each charge on a hand scale bought in Macon. The charges varied from 8 ounces to 2 pounds, depending on position and intended effect. Charges near the main road were larger, designed to crater the packed dirt and create obstacles that would funnel riders into secondary blast zones. Charges in the open fields were smaller but more numerous, creating a lattice of overlapping explosions that left nowhere to hide. Each charge was wrapped in waxed canvas against moisture. Each fuse was cut to a specific length for desired timing. Amos planned the sequence like musical composition. The first explosion would occur near the main road, drawing attention and causing panic. 3 seconds later, 4 charges would detonate in a rough square, trapping anyone who survived the first blast. 6 seconds after that, 8 charges would ignite in a wider perimeter, catching anyone trying to flee. The sequence would continue for about 40 seconds, each wave driving survivors into the next kill zone. He drew maps by candlelight at his kitchen table, sketching the property and marking each charge with a number indicating its position in the sequence. He color-coded them black ink for primary blasts, red for secondary, blue for tertiary. When he finished, he had created a choreography of violence so precise that even he found it disturbing. On January 23rd, a Sunday, Reverend Oakes approached Amos after church. "Brother Reed, you're looking tired. Are you eating enough?" "I'm fine, Reverend. Folks are talking, saying you've been acting strange. Walking your property at night, digging holes, preparing for spring planting." Oakes studied him. "If you're in some kind of trouble, the church can help." "We have." "I'm not in trouble," Amos said, "but thank you, Reverend." He walked home alone, and that night he loaded the final 3 charges. The killing field was ready. Now he waited. The Ku Klux Klan came to Talbot County in November 1867, arriving not as an invading army, but as a social club meeting Tuesday evenings in the back room of Harrison's General Store. The founding members were men of standing: James Whitfield, landowner; Augustus Harrison, merchant; Thomas Bruss, lawyer; Cyrus Bentley, physician; Elijah Cantrell, overseer. 17 men in all, united by the belief that the war's outcome had been a terrible mistake requiring correction. They called themselves the Talbot Den. They elected Whitfield as Grand Cyclops, the local leader, and paid $10 each for robes and hoods sewn by Whitfield's sister-in-law, a seamstress in Talbotton, who asked no questions about the garment's purpose. The robes were white cotton, the hoods peaked and crude, but effective. Anonymity was the point. Their early actions were theatrical rather than lethal. They rode at night to homes of black families who had registered to vote, leaving burning crosses in yards and threatening letters pinned to doors. They disrupted church services, firing pistols into the air and shouting warnings about keeping one's place. They whipped 2 black men accused of theft, tying them to trees on the public square and administering 15 lashes each, while a crowd of white townspeople watched and offered no objection. The county sheriff, William Prescott, witnessed the whipping and made no arrests. Prescott owed his election to votes from men who now wore white hoods. He understood the arithmetic of power. By spring 1868, the Talbot Den had grown to 43 members. They met weekly, discussing targets and coordinating with Klan chapters in neighboring counties. They received guidance from a regional leader called the Grand Dragon, whose real identity remained secret even to most local members. The Grand Dragon sent instructions via coded letters, which black leaders to intimidate, which white Republicans to threaten, which voting precincts to monitor on election day. The system worked. In the November 1868 elections, Republican turnout in Talbot County was the lowest in Georgia. Black men who had registered to vote stayed home, deterred by whispered threats and the memory of burning crosses. The Democratic candidates swept every race. Governor Rufus Bullock sent federal investigators to examine reports of voter intimidation, but witnesses refused to testify, and the investigators returned to Atlanta with nothing but rumors. James Whitfield's interest in Amos Reed's land predated the Klan, but the organization gave him tools to pursue goals that legal means could not achieve. At the Den's meeting on January 30th, 1869, Whitfield raised the issue. There's a colored man living 2 miles out on the Talbotton Road, sitting on 40 acres I need for expansion. I've made him fair offers. He refuses to sell. He's getting uppity. Needs to be taught respect. Thomas Bruss, the lawyer, said, "What do you propose?" "I propose we make an example. Gather enough riders to show him he can't resist. Drag him through his own fields until he understands his situation. Then give him one final chance to sell. If he refuses after that, burn everything he owns and run him out of the county." Augustus Harrison shifted in his seat. "How many riders are you thinking?" "All of them. Every den in the region. I want 200 men on horseback riding onto that property at midnight. I want him to hear us coming from a mile away. I want him to know there's no point in fighting." 200. Cyrus Bentley looked skeptical. "That's a lot of coordination. We've never assembled that many at once." "Which is why it will work," Whitfield said. "He'll see the sheer numbers and surrender. No violence necessary. Just overwhelming force that breaks his will." The vote was unanimous. Whitfield sent letters to Grand Cyclops leaders in Harris County, Meriwether County, Muskogee County, and Marion County. All agreed to participate. The raid was scheduled for February 14, 1869, Valentine's Day. The irony pleased no one, but the date stuck. On February 1st, Whitfield sent Elijah Cantrell to Amos's shop with a final message. Cantrell arrived at dusk, alone this time, without his hood. "Massacre, Whitfield wants me to tell you something. 2 weeks from tonight, you're going to have visitors. A lot of visitors. They're going to teach you what happens to colorids who don't know their place. You can avoid all this unpleasantness by accepting Mr. Whitfield's offer today. $300 final price. Otherwise, you're going to regret being stubborn." Amos was at his forge, hammering a piece of iron into shape. He did not stop hammering. "Tell Mr. Whitfield I'm staying." Cantrell stared at him. "You're a fool. You think you can stand against 200 men." "I think," Amos said, setting down his hammer and meeting Cantrell's eyes. That 200 is a good number. Makes the arithmetic easier. Cantrell left, shaking his head. That night he told Whitfield what Amos had said. Whitfield laughed. The poor bastard doesn't understand what's coming. Well, he'll learn. But Amos understood perfectly. 200 men meant 200 horses. Horses weighed about 1,000 pounds each and moved up to 30 miles per hour when charging. A mounted charge across open ground created predictable patterns. Riders bunched together for psychological effect, forming dense target formations. Horses spooked easily when explosions happened nearby, throwing riders and trampling anyone who fell. Chaos compounded chaos. 200 men, an army in their minds. In Amos's mind, 200 targets. He made his final preparations. Reverend Silas Oakes knocked on Amos Reed's door on February 7, 1869, carrying a basket of cornbread and butter. Amos opened the door but did not invite him in. "Reverend, Brother Reed, I brought you some bread. Sister Washington made it. She worries you're not eating properly." "That's kind of her." Amos accepted the basket. "Please thank her for me." Oakes made no move to leave. He was 63, born into slavery on a cotton plantation in South Carolina. Freed when his owner died, and the estate was divided among white hairs who didn't want him. He had walked to Georgia in 1847 and established himself as a preacher, serving colored communities in towns too small for formal churches. He had baptized children, buried elders, married couples, and listened to confessions for 22 years. He could read a man's soul through his eyes. What he saw in Amos Reed's eyes frightened him. "May I come in?" Oakes asked. Amos hesitated, then stepped aside. Briefly, "I have work to do." The cabin was neat, almost military. Bed made with tight corners. Small table held a Bible, a candle, nothing else. Floor swept clean. The only disorder was in the corner, where a canvas tarp covered something bulky. Oakes nodded toward it. "What's under there?" "Tools." "What kind of tools?" Amos said nothing. Oakes sat at the table without being invited. "I've been hearing things in town. White folks are talking. They say there's going to be a Klan raid. A big one. Hundreds of riders. They're saying it's going to happen here, on your property. I've heard the staying." "And you're staying?" "I'm staying." Oakes folded his hands on the table. "Brother Reed, pride is a sin. There's no shame in leaving when staying means death. I didn't come home from the war to be run off my own land by men too scared to show their faces. Those men will kill you." "Maybe." "There's no maybe about it. 200 armed riders against one man. That's not a fight. That's an execution." Amos poured coffee into 2 tin cups and set one in front of Oakes. "Reverend, I appreciate your concern, but my mind is made up." Oakes sipped the coffee. It was strong and bitter. "What are you planning?" "To defend my property." "How?" Amos met his eyes. "You don't want to know." They sat in silence. Finally, Oakes said, "Whatever you're planning, it's going to have consequences. Not just for you. For everyone in the colored community. The whites will use this as an excuse to crack down harder. More raids, more whippings, more families driven out. They're doing that already, and you're going to make it worse." "No," Amos said quietly. "I'm going to make them stop." Oakes stood. "I can't bless what you're doing." "I won't. I'm not asking you to." At the door, Oakes turned back. "I'll pray for you, and for them. Pray that God has mercy on everyone involved, because I don't think any human mercy is going to be present on February 14th. He left. Amos closed the door and stood in the center of his cabin, listening to the silence. Then he pulled the tarp off the corner pile, revealing 63 tin containers, each marked with a number. He began his final inspection. Thomas Edward Whitfield, Jr. was 16 years old on the night of February 14, 1869. He did not want to be there. His father, James Whitfield's nephew, not son, had informed him 2 days earlier that he would be riding with the clan. It's time you learned how things work, how we keep order. You're old enough now to be part of the Brotherhood. Thomas had tried to refuse. I don't want to hurt anyone. His father's face darkened. You think I care what you want? You're my son. You'll do as I say. You're riding with us Saturday night, and that's final. Thomas had no mother to appeal to. She had died of fever when he was 9. His father was all he had, and his father's word was law. So on the night of February 14th, Thomas put on the white robe and hood his father provided, and mounted a horse he had ridden since childhood. The assembly point was 5 miles north of Amos Reed's property, a clearing near the Chattahoochee River. Thomas arrived at 10:30 p.m. to find the clearing already crowded with mounted men in white robes. Torches burned at intervals, casting flickering light across the scene. Horses stamped and snorted, breath visible in the cold February air. Men talked in low voices, adjusting saddles and checking weapons. Thomas stayed near the edge, saying nothing. He recognized some of the voices despite the hoods: his father, Elijah Cantrell, Augustus Harrison. Others were strangers, men from neighboring counties who had ridden hours to participate. The sheer number was overwhelming. Thomas counted over 100 before losing track. At 1100, James Whitfield raised his hand for silence. Brothers, tonight we send a message not just to one uppity Negro, but to every colored man in Georgia. The war ended, yes, but that doesn't mean there are equals. That doesn't mean they can buy land and refuse legitimate offers from white men. That doesn't mean they can defy our authority. The murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. The man we're visiting tonight is called Amos Reed. He's living on land that should belong to one of our own. He's been warned repeatedly to leave. He's refused. Tonight, he learns the cost of that refusal. We ride onto his property. We drag him out of his cabin. We make him an example. When we're done, every Negro in this county will know that defiance has consequences. Someone shouted, "What if he fights back?" Whitfield laughed. 1 man against 200. He'd have to be insane. But if he's foolish enough to resist, we'll deal with him accordingly, permanently. The crowd roared approval. Thomas felt sick. At 11:30, the column began moving south. 200 riders in loose formation, torches held high, moving at a steady trot along the dirt road. The sound was tremendous hoofbeats like thunder, leather creaking, men shouting war cries. They sounded like an army. They felt invincible. Thomas rode near the back, trying to be inconspicuous. The boy next to him, a 17-year-old from Harris County named Jacob Sims, leaned over and shouted above the noise, "You nervous?" "Some." Thomas admitted, "Don't be. There's 200 of us and one of him. This'll be over in 10 minutes. They reached Amos Reed's property at 11:58. The land was dark. No lights in cabin or shop. The main road formed the southern boundary, and the column spread along it, preparing to charge across the fields toward the buildings. Torchlight illuminated the open ground ahead. Empty. Flat. Seemingly perfect for a mounted charge. James Whitfield rode to the front and raised his hand one final time. On my signal. Thomas gripped his reins. His horse sensed his fear and danced sideways. Charge. 200 riders spurred forward, surging across the field toward the dark cabin. Thomas went with them, carried by the momentum of bodies and horses. The thunder of hooves drowned out everything. And then the ground exploded. The first charge detonated at precisely midnight, triggered by a fuse Amos had lit from his cabin window when he heard the hoofbeats approaching. The charge was positioned 40 feet inside the property line, directly in the path of the lead riders. 2 pounds of black powder packed into hard clay soil. The explosion tore a crater 5 feet wide and 3 feet deep. 4 horses vanished in the blast, simply ceased to exist. Their riders died instantly, obliterated by force and shrapnel, before their brains could register pain. The concussion wave knocked down 24 more horses, throwing riders onto ground that was no longer ground, but churned dirt and smoke. 3 seconds later, 4 more charges detonated in a square pattern, each positioned to catch men who had veered away from the first blast. The timing was perfect, riders trying to avoid the crater rode directly into the secondary explosions. More horses fell. More men screamed. 6 seconds after that, 8 charges ignited across a wider perimeter. By now, the entire leading edge of the clan column was in chaos. Horses bolted in every direction, colliding with each other, trampling fallen riders. Men who had never seen combat discovered what combat sounded like: the roar of explosions, the screams of wounded horses, the desperate shouts of men trying to organize retreat, but unable to make themselves heard. The explosions continued. Amos had sequenced 47 charges, creating a cascade that lasted 38 seconds and transformed the flat field into a killing zone of craters and fire. The final charges were at the field's edges, cutting off escape routes and forcing survivors to flee in directions Amos had calculated would create maximum confusion. He watched from his cabin window, timing each detonation with his pocket watch. The choreography unfolded exactly as designed. When the final charge detonated, approximately 90 riders were dead or incapacitated. Another 60 were injured but mobile. The remaining 50 were scattered across the property, disoriented and terrified. Amos picked up his rifle and stepped outside. The scene was surreal. Torches lay scattered across the field, some still burning, illuminating pockets of devastation. Men crawled through dirt, searching for horses that had fled. Some sat motionless, staring at nothing, minds broken by the sudden transition from invulnerable army to helpless prey. A few tried to organize, shouting orders no one followed. Amos walked into the field with his rifle. His left leg ached from the old wound, slowing him slightly, but not enough to matter. He approached a man crawling toward the road, dragging a shattered leg behind him. The man's hood had come off, revealing a face Amos recognized. Thomas Browse, the lawyer who had stood in Whitfield's shop and agreed that uppity Negroes needed lessons. Amos aimed his rifle. Browse looked up and saw death looking back. "Please," he whispered. "I have a family." "So did I," Amos said and pulled the trigger. He moved methodically through the field, executing wounded men too injured to flee, but alive enough to identify him. His face was expressionless. His movements were efficient. He reloaded 3 times, firing with the same precision he had applied to every other aspect of the plan. At the field's edge, he found James Whitfield trapped beneath a dead horse. Whitfield was conscious, struggling to free his leg. When he saw Amos approaching, he stopped struggling. "Wait! Wait! We can negotiate. I'll pay you. 5,000 for the land." 10,000. "Name your price." Amos stood over him. "There is no price." "Then what do you want?" "For you to understand something," Amos said. "You thought 200 men made you strong. You were wrong. 200 men made you a target. 1 man with patience and a plan is stronger than an army of fools who think they're invulnerable." He shot Whitfield through the head. The killing took 19 minutes. When he finished, Amos returned to his cabin, reloaded all his weapons, and waited to see if any survivors would attempt a second assault. None came. The remaining riders had fled, scattering in every direction, their white robes abandoned in the dirt. At 2 a.m., Amos walked across his property counting bodies. He stopped at 94. Some had been killed by explosions, others by trampling, 22 by rifle fire. The numbers aligned with his calculations within acceptable margins of error. He felt nothing. The war had hollowed him out so completely that even this, the slaughter of men who had come to kill him, registered only as data. Successful operation. Objectives achieved. Casualties none. He returned to his cabin and slept for 3 hours. At dawn, survivors began returning to the field, approaching cautiously with white cloth tied to sticks. They came to collect their dead. Amos watched from his porch, rifle across his lap, but made no move to stop them. He counted 60, 7 men recovering bodies. They worked in silence, avoiding his gaze, loading corpses onto wagons and carts. One man approached the porch alone. He was young, maybe 17, not wearing a hood. His face was pale, eyes red from crying. "Are you Amos Reed?" "I am. My father is dead, so are my uncle and my cousin. I just want to collect their bodies and go home." "Go ahead." The young man hesitated. "Why did you let it happen? You could have run. You could have sold the land. Why did you choose this?" Amos looked at him a long moment. "Because running doesn't stop men like your father. Running just teaches them that threats work. I chose this so that the next time they consider riding against a colored man, they'll remember what happened here and decide it's not worth the cost." "You killed 94 people. 94 people came to kill me." The young man turned and walked back to the wagons. By noon, all the bodies were gone. Amos walked his property one final time, examining the craters and burned ground. Then he returned to his forge and began repairing a plowshare a customer had dropped off 3 days earlier. The work continued. Sheriff William Prescott arrived at Amos Reed's property at 4 p.m. on February 15, 1869. He came alone, riding a dappled mare, wearing his badge but carrying no visible weapons. He stopped his horse 30 feet from the cabin and called out, "Mr. Reed, I'm here to talk. May I approach?" Amos stepped onto his porch. He was unarmed, at least visibly. "Come ahead." Prescott dismounted and walked forward slowly, hands visible. He was 51, a Talbot County native who had been sheriff for 6 years. He had been elected on a platform of maintaining order, which in practice meant protecting white interests while managing black expectations. He was not a cruel man, but he was practical, and practicality had taught him that challenging the Klan meant losing his position, or worse. What had happened last night changed his calculations. "I've been hearing stories," Prescott said, "about what happened here. I wanted to hear your version." "My version is simple. 200 men in white hoods rode onto my property with the intention of killing me. I defended myself by killing 94 of them." "Be defending your property," Amos repeated. "I have a legal deed. I paid for this land. When armed men attack me on my own land, the law gives me the right to defend myself." Prescott rubbed his face. "That's technically true, but the law also requires proportionality. You killed 94 people, Mr. Reed, even in self-defense. That raises questions. How many attackers am I allowed to kill before it stops being self-defense? 10, 20. At what number does defending my life become murder? That's not how it works." "Then tell me how it works, Sheriff. Because from where I stand, it looks like the law protects white men who commit violence and punishes colored men who defend themselves." Prescott had no answer. He looked at the field, at the craters and scorched earth. Evidence of engineering skill that went far beyond simple self-defense. "How did you do it?" "The explosives, the timing. That was military work. I served in the Union Army, 14th Colored Infantry, Sapper Unit. They taught me how to dig tunnels and set charges. And you used those skills to create a killing field on your property." "I used those skills to defend my home." Prescott walked closer, lowering his voice. "Mr. Reed, I need you to understand the situation you're in. 94 white men are dead. Most of them were prominent citizens, landowners. merchants, professionals. Their families are demanding justice. The governor has already sent a telegram asking what happened here. Federal marshals are probably on their way. Then they can arrest the survivors who participated in the raid. That's not going to happen. Why not? They committed a crime. They came here to kill me. Because, Prescott said, choosing his words carefully, the survivors are claiming they were here for a peaceful demonstration. They say you attacked them without provocation. They say you're insane, a dangerous Negro who lured them into a trap. Bemos laughed, bitter and short. A peaceful demonstration, with 200 armed riders in hoods, at midnight. That's their story, and you believe it. Prescott met his eyes. What I believe doesn't matter. What matters is what can be proven in court. And the only witnesses are the survivors, all of whom will swear they were attacked without cause. So I should run. I'm not saying that. Then what are you saying? Prescott hesitated. This was the moment he had been dreading, the moment when his practical nature collided with his vestigial sense of right and wrong. I'm saying you have a choice. You can stay here and be arrested, tried by a jury of white men who will convict you regardless of the facts, and hanged. Or you can leave Georgia tonight and never come back. That's not a choice. That's surrender. That's survival, Prescott said. Take it or leave it. Amos looked at his cabin, his shop, his land, everything he had built, everything he had fought to keep. And if I refuse both options, then I arrest you right now, and you die in a cell before you ever see a courtroom. They stood in silence. Finally Amos said, I'm staying. If you want to arrest me, do it. But you should know that I have documentation. I recorded everything the clan did, the threats, the barn burning, the noose they left on my tree. I have witnesses who saw them assembling before the raid. If I go to trial, I'm going to testify about all of it. I'm going to name names. I'm going to describe the system that makes men like Whitfield think they can terrorize colored families without consequences. That testimony will get you killed. Then I'll die telling the truth. Prescott turned and walked back to his horse. At the road, he paused. I can give you 48 hours before I come back with a warrant. Use that time wisely. He rode away. Amos watched until he disappeared, then went inside his cabin and began writing. He wrote for 6 hours, documenting everything: the threats, the explosions, the battle, the aftermath. He wrote with the same precision he had applied to his military engineering, creating a record that could not be dismissed as emotion or exaggeration. He signed it, dated it February 15, 1869, and sealed it in an oiled envelope. Then he went to visit Reverend Oakes. Reverend Silas Oakes opened his door at 11 p.m. on February 15th to find Amos Reed standing on his porch holding a sealed envelope. Brother Reed, I heard about what happened. Come in. Amos entered the small parsonage, a 2-room building behind the Colored Baptist Church. Oakes lived alone, his wife having died 5 years earlier. The main room held a table, 2 chairs, a wood stove, and shelves of books. A single oil lamp provided light. Sit, Oakes said. I'll make coffee. While Oakes worked at the stove, Amos sat at the table and placed the envelope in front of him. Oakes brought 2 cups of coffee and sat across from him. How are you? Alive. I heard 94 men died on your property last night. 94 men came to kill me. I stopped them. Oakes sipped his coffee. And now I need your help. Amos pushed the envelope across the table. This contains my testimony, everything that happened from the moment I arrived in Talbot County until last night. Names, dates, details. If something happens to me, I need you to make sure this reaches people who will use it. What kind of people? Federal authorities. Northern newspapers. Anyone who can make sure the truth doesn't disappear. The Oaks looked at the envelope, but did not touch it. If I take this, I become part of your story. The clan will come after me. I know. I'm sorry, but you're the only person I trust. Why me? Because you already know the cost of standing up. You've been doing it for 20 years. Oaks was quiet a long moment. Then he picked up the envelope and placed it inside his Bible. I'll keep it safe. But Amos, you need to leave Georgia tonight. Whatever is in this envelope won't matter if you're dead. I'm not running. Then you're going to die. Maybe. But if I run, 94 men died for nothing. I stay. I testify. I make sure people understand what happened here. That matters more than my life. Oaks shook his head. Pride is going to get you killed. It's not pride. It's principle. If I run, I'm teaching every clan chapter in Georgia that violence works. That if they kill enough people, colored men will eventually surrender. I can't do that. They talked until past midnight. Oaks tried every argument he could think of, appealing to reason, to survival, to the greater good of the community. Amos remained unmoved. Finally, exhausted, Oaks said, "Then I'll pray for you. It's all I can do." Amos stood to leave. At the door he turned back. One more thing. There was a boy in the clan column last night. Young, maybe 16. I saw him at the edge of the fighting. He didn't participate. Just sat on his horse, looking scared. When it was over, he came to my porch asking permission to collect his family's bodies. I let him go. Why are you telling me this? Because if I die, I want someone to know I didn't kill indiscriminately. I had chances to kill men who weren't threats. I chose not to. That should be in the record. Oaks wrote it down on a scrap of paper and tucked it into the Bible with the envelope. Anything else? That's all. Amos walked home through darkness that seemed thicker than normal, as if the air itself had grown dense with waiting. He reached his cabin without incident, barred the door, loaded his rifle, and sat in a chair facing the window. He did not sleep. The arrest warrant arrived 49 hours later, not 48. Sheriff Prescott rode onto Amos Reed's property at 1 p.m. on February 17, 1869, accompanied by 6 deputized men, all armed. They stopped at the edge of the crater field, reluctant to cross ground that had killed so many 2 nights earlier. Prescott called out from horseback, "Mr. Reed, I have a warrant for your arrest. Murder of 94 men. Come out peacefully and no one else needs to get hurt." Amos appeared in his cabin doorway. On what evidence? Testimony of witnesses who survived the attack. You mean testimony of clan members who came here to kill me? That's for a court to decide. Right now, I need you to surrender. I'm not surrendering to a mob. This is not a mob. I'm a lawfully appointed sheriff executing a legal warrant. Amos looked at the 6 deputized men. He recognized 3 of them, survivors from the raid, men who had fled when the explosion started. Those men are witnesses against me. They can't also be your deputies. That's not law. That's revenge. Prescott shifted in his saddle. Mr. Reed, don't make this harder than it has to be. I'm not making it hard. You are. Come back with deputies who weren't part of the clan raid, and I'll consider surrendering. I don't have deputies who weren't part of the raid. Every able-bodied white man in this county rode with the clan 2 nights ago. The ones who survived are the only deputies I have. Then you don't have legitimate authority. Prescott conferred quietly with his men. Then he called out again, I'm giving you 1 hour to reconsider. After that, we're coming in to get you. They withdrew to the road. Amos watched them set up a perimeter, positioning men at intervals around his property. They were preparing for a siege. He inventoried his resources: 2 rifles, 1 pistol, about 80 rounds of ammunition, 3 days of food, a well for water. He could hold out maybe a week if they didn't burn the cabin. They would burn the cabin. At 20:30, a second group of riders arrived. 20 men, all armed, led by a man Amos did not recognize. The man conferred with Prescott, then rode forward alone until he was within shouting distance of the cabin. "Mr. Reed, my name is Colonel Marcus Hightower. I'm commander of the state militia. Governor Bullock has ordered me to resolve this situation peacefully, if possible. Will you speak with me?" Amos stepped onto his porch. "I'm listening." The governor is aware of the circumstances. He knows about the Klan raid. He's sympathetic to your situation. But 94 men are dead, and the law requires that someone answer for those deaths. Surrender now, and I guarantee you'll receive a fair trial in Atlanta, not here in Talbot County. You'll have access to lawyers. You'll be able to testify about what happened. You guarantee a fair trial. I do. What's your guarantee worth? You're a colonel in the Georgia militia. The militia is full of former Confederates. Why should I trust you? Hightower was silent a moment. Then he said, "Because I fought for the Confederacy, and I lost, and I accepted that loss. The war is over. I have no interest in dying for the Klan's cause. I want to go home to my family. The only way that happens is if you surrender and this ends peacefully. And if I refuse, then my men and Sheriff Prescott's men will assault this cabin. You'll die, probably taking some of us with you. Then the governor will declare martial law in Talbot County. Federal troops will occupy the area, and every colored family in this region will suffer the consequences." "Is that what you want?" Amos considered. "How do I know this isn't a trick? How do I know you won't let the Klan lynch me the moment I'm in custody?" "You don't, but you have my word as an officer." "The word of a Confederate officer. The word of a man who is tired of killing." They stared at each other across the distance. Finally Amos said, "I'll surrender on 3 conditions. First, I'm transported directly to Atlanta, not to the Talbot County Jail. Second, I'm allowed to bring my written testimony with me. Third, Reverend Silas Oakes accompanies me as a witness to ensure I arrive safely." Hightower turned and conferred with Prescott. After several minutes, he called back agreed. "All 3 conditions. Do we have a deal?" Amos looked at his cabin one final time. At the shop where he had hoped to build a life. At the 40 acres he had defended with every skill the war had taught him. He thought about running, about disappearing into the Georgia wilderness and living as a fugitive. But fugitives did not testify in courts. Fugitives did not create records that might change how future generations understood what had happened here. "We have a deal," he said. "Give me 10 minutes to gather my things." He went inside and collected the items he would need: his Bible with the numbered margins, his discharge papers, a change of clothes, the written testimony. He walked through the cabin one final time, memorizing details he knew he would never see again. Then he stepped onto the porch and raised his hands above his head. Hightower rode forward with 2 militia soldiers. They handcuffed Amos and led him to a wagon position near the road. Reverend Oakes arrived 20 minutes later, summoned by a messenger. He climbed into the wagon next to Amos. The convoy departed at 3:15 p.m. 20 militia soldiers, Sheriff Prescott, Reverend Oakes, and Amos Reed, traveling north toward Atlanta. They moved at a steady pace, stopping only twice for rest. They reached the outskirts of Atlanta at dawn on February 18th. Amos looked back toward Talbot County one final time. Smoke was rising from the direction of his property. He did not need to ask what was burning. Someone had decided that the cabin and shop should not remain standing as monuments to his defiance. Everything he had built was gone, but the testimony remained. The trial of Amos Reed began on April 12, 1869, in the Federal District Court for the Northern District of Georgia. Judge Augustus Wright presiding. The prosecution was led by District Attorney Edmund Porter. Amos was represented by a lawyer named Samuel Harris, a white attorney from Massachusetts who specialized in civil rights cases and had volunteered his services after reading about the case in northern newspapers. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled, spectators standing in the aisles and spilling into the hallway. The crowd was mostly white, but a section had been reserved for black observers, and Reverend Oakes sat in the front row of that section, Amos's written testimony folded inside his Bible. The charges were specific: 94 counts of murder. Porter's opening statement was brief. The defendant admits to killing 94 men. He claims self-defense, but the law requires proportionality. No reasonable person can argue that killing 94 people constitutes proportional self-defense. The defendant is guilty. The only question is whether he hangs or spends the rest of his life in prison. Harris's opening was longer. Amos Reed is a veteran of the Union Army who served with distinction. He returned home hoping for peace. Instead, he faced systematic intimidation from a terrorist organization that threatened his life, burned his property, and ultimately sent 200 armed men to kill him. He did not seek this confrontation. He tried repeatedly to avoid it. When avoidance failed, he used skills learned in service to his country to defend himself against overwhelming force. That is not murder. That is heroism. The prosecution called 23 witnesses, all survivors of the raid. Each told the same story. They had been riding peacefully past Amos Reed's property when explosions erupted without warning. They had been attacked unprovoked. They had not been wearing hoods or carrying weapons beyond what any prudent man carried when riding at night. They had not been part of any Klan raid. The man who claimed otherwise was lying. Harris cross-examined each witness methodically. You say you were riding past Mr. Reed's property at midnight. 200 men on horseback, all moving in the same direction by coincidence. Yes, sir. And you just happened to be riding across his property rather than along the public road. We took a shortcut. A shortcut through private property. At midnight, all 200 of you independently decided to take the same shortcut at exactly the same time. Yes, sir. Were you wearing white robes? No, sir. Harris produced a piece of charred fabric recovered from the field. White cotton with crude stitching. This was found on Mr. Reed's property after the incident. Can you explain what it is? I don't know. It's a Klan robe, scorched by explosions. Multiple identical robes were found scattered across the field. Are you claiming these robes spontaneously appeared? I don't know anything about robes. The pattern repeated with every witness. Deny everything. Claim ignorance. Accuse Amos Reed of madness and unprovoked violence. Harris called Amos to testify on the trial's fourth day. Amos spoke for 6 hours, describing everything from his arrival in Talbot County through the night of February 14th. He described the threats, the burned barn, the noose. He described the measuring rope and the stakes and the careful planning. He described watching 200 riders charge across his field and making the decision to light the first fuse. I knew most of them would die, Amos said. I knew exactly how many would die within statistical margins. That was the point. I wanted to kill enough of them that the survivors would understand the cost of attacking me. I wanted them to be afraid. I wanted every Klan member in Georgia to know that terrorizing colored people might get them killed. Porter seized on this during cross-examination. You admit to premeditated murder. I admit to premeditated self-defense. You planned their deaths in advance. I planned to defend my property against a predictable attack. You could have left. You could have sold your land. I could have surrendered to terrorism. I chose not to. At 90, 4 men died because of your pride. 90. 4 men died because they chose to participate in a lynch mob. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. They returned a verdict of guilty on all 94 counts. Judge Wright sentenced Amos Reed to life in prison. As they led him from the courtroom, Amos looked at Reverend Oakes and nodded once. Oakes understood. The testimony would be delivered to the people. Amos had named federal authorities, northern newspapers, civil rights organizations. The trial had failed to deliver justice, but the record would survive. Sometimes survival is victory enough. Thomas Edward Whitfield, Jr. did not attend the trial. He spent April 1869 working his dead father's land, trying to keep the farm operating with borrowed labor and dwindling credit. The estate was insolvent, debts larger than assets. But Thomas worked anyway, because work was better than thinking. At night, he dreamed about the explosions, the roar of powder, the screams of horses, the heat of fires that had turned midnight into hellish noon. He woke sweating, heart racing, hands shaking. The war had ended before Thomas was old enough to fight, but now he had his own war to remember, his own ghosts to carry. In May, he sold the farm for enough to cover the debts and buy passage to Texas. He left Georgia on a Wednesday morning, carrying a single bag and a leather journal he had started keeping the day after the raid. The journal contained names and dates and descriptions, a record he did not know why he was keeping, but could not stop writing. He settled in Houston and found work as a clerk in a shipping office. He married in 1872 a woman named Elizabeth who asked few questions about his past. They had 3 children. Thomas was a good father, patient and kind, but he never spoke about Georgia. When his children asked where he came from, he said, "Somewhere I'm never going back." The journal remained hidden in a locked box in his attic. In 1892, Thomas read a newspaper article about the growing movement to document Reconstruction era violence. Historians were collecting testimonies from people who had witnessed or participated in Klan activities, trying to create a comprehensive record before the participants died. The article mentioned that testimony could be submitted anonymously. Thomas retrieved the journal from the attic. He read through it for the first time in 23 years. The names were still legible: his father, his uncle, men he had known as neighbors and family friends. Men who had died because they thought 200 riders made them invulnerable. He thought about Amos Reed, who had stood on his porch and let Thomas collect his family's bodies. Who could have killed him and chose not to? He copied the journal contents into a letter, signed it, "A participant who survived," and mailed it to the address listed in the newspaper article. 6 months later, the letter was published in the Chicago Tribune under the headline, "Survivor's Account of the Talbot County Massacre." The article included Thomas's descriptions, his list of names, his admission of participation. It described how the Klan had planned the raid, how they had assembled 200 riders, how they had expected an easy victory and found instead a killing field. The article ended with a paragraph Thomas had added at the last moment. "The man we came to terrorize was named Amos Reed. He was a veteran who wanted only to live in peace. We gave him no choice except to defend himself. What happened was not murder. It was justice." The publication created a brief sensation. Northern newspapers reprinted the story. Southern newspapers denounced it as fabrication. The state of Georgia issued a statement saying that the events described were exaggerated, that Amos Reed remained a convicted murderer, that no credible evidence supported claims of a Klan raid. But the article reached the one audience that mattered. It reached Amos Reed in prison. A copy was smuggled to him by a guard sympathetic to his cause. Amos read it in his cell, and for the first time since the night of February 14th, 1869, he smiled. Someone had told the truth. Amos Reed served 32 years in the Georgia State Penitentiary, a brutal facility in Milledgeville, where conditions were designed to break men through labor, violence, and systematic deprivation. He was 49 years old when he entered in 1869 and 63 when he was released in 1901. He should not have survived. Most prisoners serving life sentences died within 10 years, victims of disease, violence, or despair. But Amos had learned during the war how to partition himself, how to endure by reducing existence to its mechanical necessities: eat, sleep, work, repeat. The prison administrators recognized his engineering skills and assigned him to the maintenance workshop, where he repaired equipment and designed improvements to the prison's infrastructure. He created a more efficient water pumping system that reduced the labor required to supply the prison wells. He designed a forge that produced better ironwork with less fuel. He taught younger prisoners basic smithing skills that might help them find work after release. In 1877, a new warden named Patrick Dunleavy arrived and implemented reforms that marginally improved conditions. Dunleavy was a rare type, a genuinely religious man who believed prisons should rehabilitate rather than merely punish. He expanded the prison library from 12 books to 200 and established a literacy program for prisoners who wanted to learn reading and writing. Amos volunteered to teach. He discovered he had a gift for instruction. He taught men who had never held a book how to sound out words, how to form letters, how to construct sentences that expressed ideas beyond the immediate and desperate. He taught using the Bible and whatever donated books the prison received: agricultural manuals, old novels, children's primers. Over 24 years, Amos taught more than 300 men to read. Some of those men were former Klan members. Amos taught them anyway. When asked why, he said, "Education destroys ignorance. Ignorance creates hate. If I can destroy ignorance, maybe I prevent future Klans." In 1893, a lawyer from Atlanta visited the prison. His name was Marcus Cole, and he specialized in post-conviction relief for prisoners who might have been wrongly convicted. He had read Thomas Whitfield's testimony in the Chicago Tribune and believed it provided grounds for appeal. "The jury convicted you based on perjured testimony," Cole explained during their first meeting. "We can prove the witnesses lied about not being Klan members. We can prove they came to your property with intent to kill you. We can argue self-defense." "I was tried 24 years ago," Amos said. "Why does it matter now?" "Because justice delayed is still justice. You should be free." The appeal process took 8 years, navigating a legal system designed to resist re-examination of closed cases. Cole argued before 3 separate courts, presenting Thomas Whitfield's testimony, Reverend Oakes's sworn statement, and physical evidence that had been suppressed during the original trial. Each court rejected the appeal on procedural grounds. Finally, in 1901, Georgia Governor Allen Candler issued a pardon, not because he believed Amos was innocent. The pardon explicitly stated that the conviction stood, but because 32 years imprisonment for acts committed in self-defense seemed sufficient punishment, and Amos had been a model prisoner who posed no threat to society. Amos Reed walked out of prison on July 4, 1901, 63 years old. His left leg ached more than ever, his hands scarred from decades of prison labor. He had no money, no home, no family, but he was free. He traveled to Atlanta and found work as a blacksmith in a shop owned by a black man named Robert Jackson. He lived in a boarding house and saved every penny he could. In 1903, he purchased a small piece of land outside Atlanta and built a cabin similar to the one he had lost in Talbot County. He lived there alone for 17 more years. Amos Reed died on November 19, 1920, at age 82. He was found in his cabin, seated at his kitchen table, his Bible open to the margins, filled with numbers no one had been able to decipher. The cause of death was listed as heart failure, but neighbors said he simply seemed ready to go, as if he had completed whatever task he had set for himself and saw no reason to continue. His funeral was attended by 47 people, nearly all black, including men he had taught to read in prison and their families. Reverend Oakes had died in 1897, but his successor at the Colored Baptist Church in Talbotton, Reverend James Washington, traveled to Atlanta to deliver the eulogy. Amos Reed was not a perfect man, Washington said. He killed 94 people in a single night. That violence was justified, but it was still violence, and it left scars on him that never healed. But he was also a man who refused to surrender to terrorism, who defended his right to exist, and who spent the second half of his life teaching others to read. History will remember the killing. We should also remember the teaching. Amos was buried in a black cemetery outside Atlanta. His gravestone was simple. Amos Reed, 1838 to 1920, H.E. Stewart. The Talbot County Massacre remained largely forgotten for decades. Local historians omitted it from county records. White families whose ancestors had died in the raid never spoke of it. The official story was that a violent insurrection by a deranged Negro had been suppressed and justice had been served. But the alternative story persisted in black communities across Georgia, passed down through generations in kitchens and churches and front porches. The story of a blacksmith who refused to run, who used his brain instead of his fear, who taught 200 Klansmen that terrorism had costs. In 1956, a graduate student at Emory University, named Patricia Morrison, discovered Thomas Whitfield's testimony while researching Reconstruction violence. She spent 2 years tracking down surviving relatives of participants, comparing newspaper accounts, and examining what little documentation remained. Her dissertation, The Talbot County Incident, Race, Violence, and Self-Defense in Reconstruction, Georgia, was the first academic treatment of the events. Morrison interviewed Thomas Whitfield's grandson, who still possessed the original journal Thomas had kept. The journal confirmed every major detail: the planned raid, the Klan's intentions, Amos's engineering of the defensive measures, the death toll. Morrison's work transformed the massacre from folklore into documented history. In 2008, the Georgia legislature passed a resolution acknowledging that Amos Reed had acted in lawful self-defense and posthumously vacating his murder conviction. The resolution was largely symbolic. Amos had been dead for 88 years. But it represented official recognition that justice in 1869 had failed. Today, a historical marker stands on the site where Amos Reed's property once was. The land is now a soybean field. No trace remains of the cabin or shop or craters. The marker reads Owen Trice 18 February 1869, Amos Reed a uno ar and veteran. Defendidekis PR preparada in estatia utrikex kalanan rad, hesa ctos rificalate in oni of t ladivesti a is guilty is evr in fli futedua eklen. Aridis kavistid of mar dr and sarvidi 32 a in pure so I in 2008 ge nilo didi jidicius ashitio and smiral idiosilf defenis. Visitors sometimes leave flowers at the marker. Others leave stones, the Jewish tradition of honoring the dead. A few leave small pieces of metal, horseshoes, nails, iron stakes. Tributes to the blacksmith who remembered too much. Old-timers in Talbot County still warn children not to play in certain fields outside Talbotton, saying the ground is cursed. That on February nights, you can hear hoofbeats and explosions. The ghosts of 200 men learning what happens when patience transforms into mathematics, and a single man decides he will not run. Subscribe if you want the next deep dive.